I was kind of amazed that looking at it from a journalist's perspective, there's just a series of open goals. There are all these people saying you one thing, and then there's evidence that suggests something else, which is not only ignored, but you're insulted. You're compared to a denier of the Jewish Holocaust, for instance, if you actually sort of, say something.
Welcome to the Tom Nelson podcast. I have Chris Morrison here. And Chris, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm the environment editor for the Daily Sceptic blog based here in London, but we have obviously a big international audience. I'm basically a journalist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a lot of things. I try to be a musician. I'm not a musician either. I'm a journalist, and I did a history and politics degree in the early 70s. And I always, I think, wanted to be a journalist because I was very taken by and influenced by people like Woodward and Bernstein in the United States who, did the Watergate inquiries. There was a lot of that sort of investigation of journalism in those days. In the UK here, we had the Insight team on the Sunday Times, Panorama, BBC, World in Action, various programs on television. And they would have teams of journalists and they would piece together important investigative work. And I was always influenced by that. I liked the idea, particularly Woodward and Bernstein, the way that they would take a single fact that they learned that day or over the week, and they would make a news story out of it. But they would also add it to this narrative that we're building on. Obviously, their narrative was the corruption in the Nixon White House, and eventually, of course, we know what happened. So I always enjoyed that. I got a job in the mid 70s when I left college. My first job was as a financial journalist. And I took a job it was actually an insurance publication. And for about 10 years, I sort of happily, I did a number of jobs. I did a lot of freelance. I wrote about all sorts of financial things. I used to write about, the personal finance pages that you get in newspapers. I wrote about banking. Obviously, I wrote about insurance. But I also particularly was interested in a subject called reinsurance, which are the wholesale markets, many of which are based here in London at the time. And that is where the big risks come and people divide them up, they underwrite them. And in London in the 80s, there was a particularly Wild West type of environment. We had Lloyd's that suddenly, from this very prestigious market, grew from 2,000 names to 20,000 names or investors. And there was a lot of fraud going on. There was a huge Ponzi scheme that was developing. And I spent quite a bit of the 80s reporting on that. Other things as well. There also, the London market was a bit Wild West. So company markets, anybody could come. Anybody could come with money. They frequently got ripped off. There was all sorts of things going on. And I started editing what's called a newsletter, which is an ad-free subscription publication called The Re-Report, which obviously talked about reinsurance. And I did this. I used to edit it in more or less every second weekend. It helped pay for my first mortgage almost. And I did it for about 5 years. And then the owner, or the owners who I got on very well with, or had a good relationship, they said they were going to sell it. And so I said, well, would you, think about, selling it to me? And so after a convivial lunch, I ended up as the owner of the Re-Report, which I proceeded to sort of pay off over about a year. And after a year, I owned it. And then I just really sort of used it. I started on a newsletter to the subscribers of the Re-Report. And over about the next 17, 18 years, I just grew a company, my own company, selling essentially information, financial information I'd done as a journalist, a working journalist. And in the end, it grew to a nice little operation. We employed about 25 people. It was profitable. We started all sorts of publications, conferences. We were selling information, basically directories. But I was always aware in the 90s that there was this thing called the internet coming along. And we actually, embraced it. I had newsletters about it, in fact, but they were printed on dead trees. So I kind of thought, well, this is not going to last forever. And a lot of colleagues we used to talk about, we knew that the world was changing, that the subscription models that we'd had where you essentially ask someone, send me $1,000 and I'll tell you something in now and I'll tell you something in 12 months time. We knew that was going to change and we knew it was going to change to tell me something yesterday and I don't want to pay you for it. So a big corporate eventually came along and offered me slightly more money than it was worth and told me to get lost. And so I took the money and got lost. And so I sold the company. And at the time, I guess I thought I was an entrepreneur. Well, I didn't think I was an entrepreneur, but I thought like an entrepreneur. And so I did try one or two other things. But I guess my heart wasn't completely in it because, I didn't mind running a company. But, you've got, getting on Monday and there's 300 things that go wrong and you've got to sort them out and this sort of thing. There's a lot of minutiae involved in it. And so I was quite happy to take a break from that. So I then dallied with the music business and I learned piano and all sorts of things. And I eventually did something I suppose is on a bucket list a lot of guys my age or whatever. And so I joined a band. And I joined on quite a few bands at that. And in particular, I joined one original band, some very talented musicians, and we started playing around pubs and clubs and this sort of thing. And it was all, it was good fun. I mean, it was very enjoyable. And then, like all bands and all musicians, of course, it all broke up suddenly. Nothing to do with me, it just broke up. I don't, even to this day, which was a shame because they were, we were getting some slightly better gigs. The thing about music, I guess, is that unless you learn piano from 5, you're only ever in the foothills. Always knew that I was a bit of a blagger, I guess, in the music business. I mean, I can play a few chords in a band and jog along with it, sort of, but I didn't really compose very much or anything, so it was a nice little interlude. And then I started writing again. And I think I probably realized that at heart I was a hack as a journalist. And I always say I've met 3 groups of people really in my life: musicians, journalists, and entrepreneurs. And I always use the example of who would you most want to go with a drink with? And journalists, yes, they're great fun, gossipy, whatever. Musicians, they kind of live on planet Zog a little bit. You're not a musician yourself, I hope.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, nice people, but basically, they do have other. I mean, the problem with the music business, they all think they're going to be very famous. It's like actors, and then 99.9% of them don't become famous, and then they think, well, I can write bloody songs like that. It's just as good as some bloke I used to sort of do open mics with, and he's famous, or she's famous. So you get a bit of that. And entrepreneurs, who I got to like, because I like people who see the world as it is, and a lot of people don't see the world as it is. A lot of people want to live life with a certain amount of delusion, and so with entrepreneurs, if you want to make money, then you have to see the world as it is, not as you want it to be. And so I always found them very down to earth and practical. And I've always tried to sort of root my journalism in that you see the world as it is, not, as you want it to be. And so I started coming back to writing. I thought I was just interested in climate change because it was obviously developing the last 20 years. I was interested in the subjects. My brother, who lives in the United States, was also very interested in it. He used to talk. And so I started looking at some of the evidence behind this settled science. And I was kind of amazed that, looking at it from a journalist's perspective, there's just a series of open goals. There are all these people saying you one thing, and then there's evidence that suggests something else, which is not only ignored, but you're insulted. You're compared to a denier of the Jewish Holocaust, for instance, if you actually sort of, say something. And so straight away, as a journalist, it started to interest me greatly, because you've got a whole subject here that is not, in my view, being covered. It's a little bit, when I used to cover the Lloyd's crisis, you essentially had this very, very august institution that was taken over. It was essentially become a Ponzi scheme. And you had people at the top who would skim, like a good mafia boss, would skim the casino by funneling into offshore reinsurance companies, the risks that they knew they wouldn't have to pay out on. And you also had increasing losses because of increased competition and a desire to suck in more people into the scheme to provide the capital. We were quite clear what was going on. We covered it on that basis, and eventually the thing did more or less collapse. But it wasn't covered like that in much of the mainstream media, which of course was all about how wonderful the institution was. And so it struck me that climate change was a little bit like that you had the mainstream narrative that essentially said there was this existential crisis and that we ought to take away fossil fuel. And you start to think, well, if you know any history, that, most, human societies have had existential crises. They don't think they're going to die, the next day. It's been a sort of a constant in human society. And there was this unwillingness to look at the science. The idea that carbon dioxide was the only and the main climate thermostat didn't seem to be borne out by a lot of the observations, for instance. As you know, as you look in the near historical paleoclimatic, it's far easier to say that carbon dioxide isn't the main. It is, it has warming properties, we know that. But it isn't the main one because the evidence doesn't show any real connections, ice cores, whatever, all this sort of thing. And so the suggestion that, for instance, carbon dioxide becomes saturated, that its ability to warm becomes rather rhythmic and its abilities fall away to a certain extent, seems to bear up more of the evidence. Now, it's still an unproven hypothesis, that sort of idea of the saturation of the gas, but so also is the hypothesis that it's the only warming determinant of all climate change. And as Professor Pliner says quite clearly, if there was a single science paper that proved conclusively that humans cause almost global warming by burning fossil fuels, you would not hear the last of it. And of course, there isn't any. And so you just have this sort of myth of settled science growing up. So yes, there are all these sort of open goals. And the other thing that we've been doing recently that I particularly, find incredible is the surface data sets. We've had two pauses, as you know, temperature pauses, one for about 1998, 2000, 2014. And we've had a pause now for the last 8 years. Now, they're pauses from the satellite record. And they were pauses, the first one in 2000 for 14 years or so, they were pauses in the surface data sets. The Met Office, for instance, wrote 3 papers. You can still see them on their website called The Pause. And they talked about pause, but alas, the pause didn't last the upward adjustments that they made to the surface data sets. So we have Hadcrux 3 to Hadcrux 4, I think, and then Hadcrux 5, each put on 15% of global warming, and the pauses magically disappeared, and it is no more. And then, of course, there's this pause of 8 years, which is rather inconvenient as well, and people are starting to sort of notice it a bit, and they're having to use the same arguments. Well, I mean, are they going to keep adjusting the data set upwards? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they have very good reasons for adjusting the data set upwards, reasons which have so far escaped the more accurate satellite record. And then you look at the fact that they use satellites for everything else in climate change, for measuring ice and all sorts of things, but they don't use it for temperatures. And so these seem to be simple journalistic questions. Why? You just ask them why. Then, of course, you get to the other thing which you've done on the Daily Sceptic, where we questioned you probably saw it, the recent UK record of 40.3 centigrade, which was declared on July the 19th last year. Or, as I more accurately call it, RAF Conisbee. RAF standing for Royal Air Force. It's a military base, and the thermometer is halfway down the runway. And we wrote an article in the Skeptic pointing out that the record only stood for 60 seconds at 3:12, and at 3:10, up to 3:12, the temperature jumped by 6 degrees, and a minute later, at 3:13, it was back down by 0.6 degrees centigrade. So we were pointing out that, well, one can speculate why that's caused, but it would appear to be something non-climatic, or in fact, possibly of a sort of typhoon fighter jet nature that caused it. And yet this record is repeated almost daily on the BBC and the Guardian and all these people, as is the suggestion, for instance, at the Pakistan floods earlier last year, which are said to have inundated 33% of the country. And you only have to look, if you're at all an inquiring journalist, or, you shouldn't even need to put the word inquiring in front of the word journalist. You only need to look at the geographical map and see that's almost impossible, because Pakistan is actually quite hilly. And also, you can look at the UN Relief Agency records, freely available to any inquiring journalist, and you'll see that the figure is 8%. And it's actually 8%. And yet that figure of 33%, which was used once by a politician in Pakistan who was, to be fair to him, he was under pressure. The country had suffered a major tragedy, and they were looking for overseas funds. But nevertheless, come on, journalists, you can't just keep repeating that figure when it's been debunked, beyond dispute. And so you start to ask questions, why is all this going on? I should just say a call out for the Daily Sceptic. The Daily started by quite a well-known journalist in the UK here, Toby Young. And Toby's, well known, he writes for a lot of publications. And he started it in lockdown with the COVID pandemic, and he called it a Lockdown Skeptic. And it really looked at a lot of the alternative, not alternative, but all of the epidemiology inputs, everything to do with COVID, how serious was the disease, the effects of lockdown, the horrible effects of lockdown, at least subsequently discovered, a lot of the politics. We had a situation in this country, just like the climate, where we used to have 5 o'clock press conferences from the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, and he would sort of stand up with gloom and doom, and there'd be a sort of scientists, and they'd all have graphs all going up, in a vertical line, showing how dreadful things were, and models and all this sort of stuff. As climate, you hear exactly the same. And then all the questions from the journalists who all religiously sit there, would be, Mr. Johnson, why are you killing, thousands of people? Why haven't you locked down harder and quicker, before now? I mean, it was just, and again, you saw the same sort of traducing of any alternative view, with any suggestion that this was a respiratory disease that essentially killed very old, very infirm people, and certainly wasn't a risk enough to justify locking down and depriving school children of 2 years education and all the things that went on. And so Toby wrote about this, and about a year ago, obviously, as we started to come out of lockdown, he thought, well, what should I do with this blog? It would be an interesting historical thing to keep up, for people when they want to analyze what happened in this period. But he decided to morph it into a more general skeptical blog. And why not? Because he got an enormous circulation, an enormous influential circulation as well. It's read by a lot of other journalists, and there are a few other skeptical journalists as well, and politicians. And so he morphed it. And so we now cover 3 things. We cover climate change, net zero, the woke agenda, and still the medical side, still the pandemic, the aftermath and all this sort of thing. And I came on board, just after he did this, and I've been working ever since. It's a great place to work because he allows me to really give me free rein over where I want to go. Because I find as I write things, one door opens up into another. So, for instance, the surface temperature data sets open up into what they're doing, why they're doing it, why these are being promoted and not the satellites, and all these things. One door opens up into another. And so, so it's widely read, and it's a lot of the material we produce, not just mine, but I think a lot of the material we produce is actually very valuable in just giving there are always alternative views to the mainstream.
I'm very curious about the whole mainstream journalism narrative here, that you come from a mainstream background in journalism, would you say?
Yeah, well, I suppose the word mainstream, we never used those words in back in the day. You were just a journalist. You wouldn't have said, the Washington Post, well, because they just didn't exist. All the online, all the blogs and all this sort of stuff, 30 years ago in the 80s. In a way, the business I got into, which was the newsletter business, was actually quite revolutionary, because what it was, and it really started in America. I used to come to America a lot, in particular in the Washington, D.C. area. It started from a lot of journalists who would write very specialist. As Washington became more of a government town, well, it always was, but there was more government, basically. And so there'd be very specialist publications. The Washington Post might cover it on a macro basis. You think of it as the newsletters will cover it on a micro basis. And so in the newsletter business, you can get anything from looking at telecommunications, health, like the one I started on was on reinsurance, but very specific subjects, but trying to charge a high price to a smaller audience, rather than the idea of newsletters, of magazines and newspapers that tried to have a wider audience and then sell ads on the basis of it, but charge a much lower price. And in fact, there was a lot of specialization. We always used to have fun thinking of titles that you could think of newsletters, and my favorite was always Funeral Service Insider, except that there was actually a newsletter called Funeral Service Insider. And it was very successful, apparently, because when you think of it, funeral directors, nobody's writing about them. They feel lonely. They want information about a perfectly reasonable, respectable business. So that was, if you like, maybe the newsletters, which morphed really into online. Even when I was around the 90s, it was an idea of more specialist forms of communication, and it was made possible by, basically newsletters were easier to print. Before that, particularly in the UK, there'd been a dominance of print unions. You couldn't get anything printed unless you went through all these sort of, archaic practices. Some of the early techniques in printing meant that you could produce these publications more cheaper. So that kind of morphed, really. By the time I left, because I was involved in a trade association in Washington, we become online publishers, and so really then you start to see these things morphing onto, or going on to the online environment. And then, of course, you got the growth of blogs, and really anybody can be a publisher. You just need to put up on the net. On Twitter, they're publishers, they're doing social media posts, they're publishing, they're doing publishing stuff. And I suppose then the distinctions arisen with mainstream by calling, you could also call them what we call legacy publishing, the Dead Trees Brigade, newspapers on dead trees, and the big magazines that had circulations on newsstands and sort of thing, and still very dominant. I would call BBC in this country a mainstream media publication, and it will continue to be a mainstream media, not because of the quality of any of its work, although some of it is fine, but because there's essentially a poll tax on everybody in the UK who has a television receiver has to pay what is about $200 to the government or to BBC. So they will remain as mainstream media because they have an enormous amount of money that they collect on a compulsory basis. So yes. So I think, short answer to your question is everybody worked on the mainstream media back in the day. But now there is you can see this distinction really between, and again, it's quite interesting really, because it does mean that things like, Toby's blog, can come and become, substantial publication. The trick is always to monetize it, of course. How do you sort of, make money? The problem I think that people have on, if you like, the right of the political spectrum, as you call it, inquiring about these things on the right. I think we know what we mean by that. But the problem is to monetize, because you've got this huge opposition. You've got campaign groups that will, try and persuade woke corporations not to go anywhere near anybody who expresses views outside, if you like, the mainstream left wing, if you like, agenda. And so you have to find other ways. There are other ways. There are other ways to monetize it, but it is probably more difficult in the past, when people were perhaps more prepared to pay a subscription fee, or at least a fee for a magazine.
So what is really preventing mainstream journalists from doing what you're doing and actually just ripping apart the climate scam? Like, there was Christopher Booker, wasn't he mainstream back in the day? And he was doing it, but who else is doing it now besides you? I mean, James Delingpole.
I mean, but it's a sort of, I was going to say, it's the dying breed. In the case of Christopher Booker, alas, he did die, he passed away. And he was a real pain in the arse, if you excuse my language, for a lot of the climate activists, because he had a very, very big spot on the Sunday Telegraph, I think it was. And he was very influential. James Delingpole was another one. James, I think, has sort of retired, as far as I can see, from writing about climate recently. But, he certainly did a hell of a shift in spell. And I think he was connected with the Telegraph and the Spectator. There are still people around. I can still think of people who are writing. Ross Clark writes very well, very skeptically on net zero. He writes for Spectator, Daily Mail. There are still one or two, but I mean, something like the Daily Telegraph was highly skeptical. The people working there now just follow the mainstream line. There isn't anything like the investigation that there used to be, because I don't know. I mean, there just isn't. You see it in academia. Why aren't there more Richard Lindsons, William Happers? Partly it's because these guys, they're all getting older and they're not being replaced. And if you are a newspaper, broadcast media, you will find it very difficult to get advertising if you start being particularly skeptical about the climate. Now, there are, I would say, two honourable exceptions on the broadcast side. We recently had a TV company set up called GB News. I don't know if you heard of it.
Yes.
Mark Stein's the big star, the 8 o'clock show. We had GB News, and we've also had Talk TV, which is owned by Murdoch, which has morphed from a radio station to a TV station. And I think you've been on it. You've been on Richard Tyson's show.
Yeah, you just were too, right?
Yeah, I was on a couple of times. I saw them going there, and they will, take a skeptical view. I mean, I'm saying journalists that I know on Talk TV are highly skeptical of the climate change. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Julia Hartley-Brewer, Kevin O'Sullivan. They all, they call it a scam. So there are people in the mainstream media, and GB News again is highly skeptical. I mean, Lawrence Fox, for instance, the actor, has got a show now, and he's very skeptical. So there are people around, but it's a hard road to plow. I mean, for myself, I was going back to the music business. I saw Bill Wyman, the bassist for the Rolling Stones. I saw him a few years ago, and he was with a band called Bill Wyman and his Rhythm Kings, and it was all these old blokes, that used to play with back in the 60s. And Bill Wyman came on first on stage, and he shuffled on. He said, "This is not a career move." He was doing it, if you like, not for the fun, but he was doing it because that's what he did, And so in a way, I kind of feel that with job on the Daily Sceptic, that I'm doing it because I actually, really enjoy the writing, and I just enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy a subject where you can operate, I think, as a journalist should operate, as an inquiring journalist. It's a subject with all these open goals, all these stories that, have other sides to them that are, as far as I can see, and as far as many people can see, perfectly reasonable explanations and perfectly reasonable things to write.
What do you think is preventing climate realists from working at the BBC? If they're smart enough to be a climate realist, they don't even try to go to the BBC? Are there people at the BBC that know that it's all baloney, but to keep their jobs, they're still pretending to believe in it? What do you think?
Well, certainly there is that. Yeah. They might take a very skeptical view. You just wouldn't get a job at the BBC. There's no. If the BBC phoned me up, because I sort of do, I was on Rich's show. I do some bits for GB News. If the BBC phoned me up, I think I would say no. I'd fear a setup. I just know. This is an organisation that sent around memos saying that the other side essentially must not be shown on TV. They think that journalists who do this sort of work are the devil. I'll give you one example of the way the narrative is sown into, and I'm sure you see it all the time in the States. I was listening to the Radio 4, which is one of the BBC radio shows today, and the sports editor was talking about a bid for Manchester United, the football team here, by a chap called Jim Radcliffe. Now, Jim Radcliffe runs a big industrial company called Inos. And Inos made a lot of money by basically buying up chemical operations that the big corporates didn't want. They were just too uneconomic. And so he's heavily into chemicals, oil and gas, energy. His chemicals, make sterilizing solutions for hospitals and antifreeze and all these sorts of useful things. And the journalist said, oh, well, Jim Radcliffe's getting into the sports business because he wants to smooth over his company's image. What are these people smoking? In a studio, plastic everywhere, heated, everything that, Jim Radcliffe provides the chemicals for. And you're saying he needs to smooth his image as if he's sort of, the Taliban or something, completely barking mad. It was Patrick Moore, wasn't it, who said that he left Greenpeace after having helped run it for 15 years. He left them when they tried to demonize chlorine. He said, once they started demonizing the periodic table, I thought that was time to go. It was a sports bit, he wasn't even thinking about it. It just comes out naturally. That is the way they constantly talk. So this narrative is now utterly woven into everything. The narrative is, it's a political, I write about it a lot on Daily Sceptic. I call it a command and control net zero political agenda. It is essentially a left-wing agenda to command, control. The science, as they don't want to talk about science because that's just gets in the way. The science is settled, didn't you? And you heard, hadn't you got that memo? And it is all about taking out the fossil fuel, which is about 80% of our energy. It was 100 years ago, and we both know it probably will be in 100 years' time. It's this totally impractical idea that you can somehow take out energy, which drives industrial society. Without energy, we're back in caves. We're back in medieval times. King Charles, Prince Charles at the time, can talk about the end of consumerism and consumption. But of course, he doesn't think it applies to him because, back in medieval times, he was still, living a similar life to what he's leaving now, So the whole thing is built up to this net zero narrative. And unless you go along with that, unless you believe that the world is under an existential threat, unless you believe that the only way to cure it is to remove 4% that humans contribute to the carbon dioxide cycle and hope that the other 96% presumably will behave itself when we remove all of our fossil fuel burden. Unless you do that, you won't even get in the door at the BBC or ITV or any of the other commercial channels. So no, there is no chance that you will see these alternative views on the BBC.
So how popular is net zero in the UK? Do you think the public is willing to give up their cars and meat and et cetera? Are they buying this?
It depends what questions ask. If you say, are you in favor of net zero or else we're all going to die? People will say, yes, I'm in favor of net zero. So you always have to work out exactly what. I don't think that people have any idea what is involved by net zero. They're just at the virtue signal on stage. And a lot of people, seriously, a lot of people think there is an existential threat. They've had 20 years of brainwashing that we know goes throughout schools, academia, because we talk about getting jobs in the mainstream media. You wouldn't get a job in academia now if you question climate change. All these billions of pounds are going to academia, going into media operations as well. The Guardian gets millions from foundations such as Bill Gates. Well, the public is buying it. I just don't think that they have any idea that if you take out the one cheap, reliable, efficient fuel we have from the mix, just how disastrous it will be. Everything you see about net zero, the minerals needed for the batteries in short supply, and then the batteries have to be replaced after 10 years. So what are we going to do then? We know about, millions of bats being killed by onshore wind farms. We know that children are mining cobalt in the Congo. We know that none of the things that are promoted, energy from the wind and the sun, electric cars, heat pumps. None of them would stand a chance in the free market. They all have to be sort of subsidized. And the reason they don't is that they're all totally inferior products. And, and a lot of people who are promoting this net zero, upper middle class people, obviously don't think it belongs, it would apply to them, like King Charles, and just at the virtue signaling stage. So I think it's too early to, and I'm not actually personally in favor. There's a certain amount of debate in this country about whether we should have a referendum on net zero. I'm personally, I mean, if there was one, I would obviously be on the side that net zero should be abolished. But I don't think I wouldn't like one, because there's a danger, for goodness sake, that it would actually be passed. Because you'd have the BBC who would simply go into overdrive on promoting it. Most people don't have any idea of the scale of the disaster that's coming if we go down it. They just see all the brainwashing, the virtue signaling. There's a danger it will actually pass. And then, of course, if it passes, then it would be very difficult to reverse. So, no, it's very early to start saying that the public is in favour or not in favour. But what we are seeing, I think, is we're starting to see more realism. We're seeing more people question the net zero agenda. You do see a bit more stories about the millions of bats being killed. You do see more stories about these battery cars, they don't seem to work very well. They only go about 200 miles. I mean, for a little run around a town, they're fine, and if you've got to drive and you can plug it in. But for anybody else, they're totally impractical. Then people start to say about the meat. They say, oh, what you mean? I will stop eating less meat, or I will have no foreign holidays. They say, oh, I didn't think it applied to me. Only me. Oh, well, I'm not sure I'm quite as in favour of this net zero malarkey as I might have thought before, and it goes further than that. I mean, we had an actress. She came out a year or so ago and said that it was time maybe to consider wartime rations. Wartime, because I was born after the Second World War, but certainly I remember my parents. Sort of the food they used to eat. I mean, the food in the 1950s in England didn't really recover from the 1940s. It was still very similar, And I can't imagine someone like, Joanna Lumley, a national treasure over here, having a dinner of a tin of snook and a thin slice of bread margarine, I mean, because that's what wartime rations were. People were a bit hungry. There was no obesity. I mean, if you see photographs of people in the 40s, there was no obesity at all. But they were actually quite enough to eat, And so people start to say, well, I don't know about that. I mean, it sounds good to have a little bit of the virtue signal and all that sort of thing, but actually in practice, they ain't going to happen.
So that is the message I'm getting from a lot of the people that I've interviewed on this podcast, that talk is cheap and people are willing to say, oh, yeah, of course I believe in it. But as soon as the pain hits, then they're going to say, wait a minute, maybe this is not the way to go. I think they're probably right when they say that. One other thing I wanted to mention is that in terms of people waking up, I had Malcolm Roberts on my podcast, and I put up some tweets and clips yesterday, and I had 2 million Twitter impressions yesterday on those tweets. And people are spending right now about 2,000 hours a day watching this podcast. So there is some interest in the realism, I think. I think the success of the Daily Sceptic is a huge one, right? Yeah.
I mean, I've been, we get over 2 million hits a month, and it's climbing. And, I see, a lot of the retweets from my stuff, and, there are certain things that go gangbusters. The ice always does very well. You become a bit of because for me, it's a sort of new business, this social media stuff. I wasn't really around when I was sort of practicing journalism for social media. And you do become a bit of a social media tart in that you you get to know which is going to work and which isn't. So I do write articles thinking, no, I'm going to write this article. It will do okay on a tweet, but we need to write it, and we do have 17,000 readers, I think, that get it on an email, every day. But I know that if I write, for instance, about, this is another story that I was always amazed at. I mean, the Arctic ice. I mean, it's actually growing back. It's like the corals, it's growing back. I mean, it's all been ignored. I mean, you're not talking about huge amounts in the Arctic, but Tony Heller does some very interesting work.
Yes.
We showed that the decline had really stopped from about 210, and that there'd been a sort of a small increase since then. And certainly, the Greenland ice sheet, for instance. I mean, I did a story that last year it put on 500 gigatons of surface mass. And if it's generally accepted that it loses 500 gigatons or so from calving and around the coast. Well, and that actually comes from satellites, which are very good, but not perfect. And so if you allow, say, a 10% margin of error on the satellite modeling, it's quite possible the Greenland ice sheet actually increased in size last year. Or it certainly didn't lose very much. Was that in mainstream media? You'd search high and low for any mention of that. So, and the Corals was a big disappointment last year, but they haven't quite got over it. In fact, the Guardian a couple of days ago actually wrote a piece about corals, suggesting that they're all being bleached again. But and the polar bears. I mean, don't mention the polar bears. I mean, there's more polar bears than you can shake the stick at. And all of these things are interesting stories. But always when you're looking at climate, you're looking at long-term trends. So you look at the cyclical nature of the Arctic ice, and you can see if you look in the back record, that even going back to 1800, the observations of the naval people reporting back is that obviously it appears that the Arctic ice's surface sea ice is cyclical, and it goes up and it goes down. And we had recently a downward period, and there's a amount of science that looks at the Atlantic multi-decal oscillation, isn't it, where the waters warm up and pulse warm water into the Arctic. And so you see all of this. And it's all just ignored. We had David Attenborough, another national treasure, with his latest Frozen Planet on the BBC, repeated twice that all of the summer sea ice could be gone by 2035. I mean, he was telling his readers, his audience, basically that they'd be running swimming galas across the North Pole. I mean, it's all just sort of, and where does it come from? Because we tracked it down and wrote a story about it. It comes from a model that, written by a couple of people modeling, they think it might all be gone. Well, the thing is that if you actually look at the long-term record and you look at the cyclical nature of Arctic ice, it probably won't all be gone.
One of my favorites was when a while back, John Holdren warned about the summer sea ice going in the Arctic, and not long after, then the winter sea ice would be gone. He actually said that.
Yeah, the winter ice. When you look at, when I was researching my story on Greenland, apparently it only melts for about 2 months or so in Greenland anyway, because they have a short summer. And then by the time you get to September, it's minus goodness knows what, and last time I looked, ice froze at 0 degrees centigrade, so if the average temperature from September onwards is in the minuses, you're going to get ice, aren't you?
Absolutely. So do you think we've seen peak climate hysteria? And what do you think in the next 10 years or 15 years, which way is it going to go? Think it's going to fade away or still be around in 15 years, let's say?
I always sort of, questions like that, I always say it's sort of kind of beyond my pay grade. I mean, you're looking to really speculate, aren't you? I think that, if you want what's my personal opinion, I think it can hardly get worse. But I think people have been completely and utterly brainwashed, really a good word, or they certainly been highly influenced to believe this whole net zero agenda. You see, I look at net zero also in political terms. I think that if you look at the history of the Green Movement, it essentially is a hard left. It's a move towards the collectivist. Rupert Darwin wrote that very good book on green tyranny when he stretched it back to the days of the collectivist movements in the 30s, and we know that Soviet Union communism failed as it did across Europe. And all these people switched, to environmentalism because it gives the same sort of command and control economy that they dream of, controlling the commanding heights. We saw it in COVID. A lot of people who are of Marxist sympathies, they were always the ones who were saying that, wear masks forevermore and stay indoors. And they all work in the public sector. They all have no idea how wealth is created. As far as I can see, they just think that that the money grows on trees, that they'll always have a job and a gold-plated pension, whatever they do or say. And I think there is a certain Malthusian background to it. I mean, David Attenborough himself, made some very disobliging comments about not sending grain to Ethiopia. He talks about how he hasn't seen a problem that's not solved in the world, that, by having, less people around. There's always that Malthusian thing, that there's a Puritan drive that runs into it, the idea of people enjoying themselves. I sort of, nearly 70 years and 10, and I was born, after the war, Second World War. And really, if you lived in Western Europe, America, many parts of the world, it's been a golden age of prosperity. There's been little warfare that's affected us. There have been wars, of course, but nothing like the cataclysmic wars of the 20th century. And that I think that there was an article recently in Newsweek, talking about the boredom of the bourgeoisie. I mean, I remember when I went to college and, sort of dabbling in the sort of, summer of love and all that hippie stuff and whatever, I mean, as Jane Delville once said, never trust an old hippie, I remember going to San Francisco and thinking I was in sort of, Nirvana, this sort of mythical city on the bay, with a summer alarm. And of course, you get there and you say, well, it all stopped. It only lasted about 3 months, and it all ended up in drug taking, gang rapes, and homelessness. But we won't go there. So it wasn't quite as idealistic. And I think, I think that it's a generation maybe that has almost had too much prosperity. They got bored. They got bored of it. They don't realize that actually, if you're a historian of any sort, you know that 99.9% of people have lived in conditions that are far worse than the conditions that you're living in, and that it can return. It can return because, unless, humans have to strive, they have to make their way in on this planet like any other species. And so really, I think they just got bored with prosperity. There's too much choice. And well, certainly not necessarily the vast majority of people who live in conditions of poverty, but the upper middle classes, the people who run the mainstream media and whatever. And I just think it's a certain decadence, really, as set in, which I think we've seen in the past. You see decadent societies eventually fall. I think we need to be very careful about, and realize that the human condition is slightly more fragile. I'm not talking about climate here. It's slightly more fragile than we think, and that we need to protect what we've got. And all of this net zero nonsense is just barking mad. I mean, it is just absolute nonsense on stilts. The idea, as I say, that you can remove 85% of your energy and still carry on as if nothing's happened. It's just for the birds, And so will society, I think, go as far as they come to its senses? I think it will, because I think that people don't like being poor. They don't like being... Andrew Montfort of the Global Warming Policy Foundation was on a radio station recently, and he was talking about this backlash has been already about battery cars. The fact that, their range anxiety, their range goes right down in winter. They're just not. And he said that, and he was talking, I think, also about heating this. He said people will need to feel pain before they step back. And alas, I mean, I don't wish pain on anybody, but alas, I think that people will need to see the consequences of these actions in order to think, as I say, didn't think it applied to me. I mean, I can't go to Spain and watch football on the Costa del Sol, and drink beer and have a nice time. No, that's been banned. There are too many of you. All these nice beaches on the Riviera have to be kept for the likes of climate change conferences and people who are doing good. The old ZIL lanes that they had in the old Soviet Union, where they had what they call ZIL lanes, where the ZIL limos used to go, and they had free access. They could drive around the city. And so, I think when people start to realize that what's been planned for them, and I think there will be a pushback. Yeah.
Excellent. So we're nearing the 1 hour mark here. Do you have any other points you'd like to make before we go ahead and finish up?
No, I think I've been talking quite a long time. I think I've really sort of given you some idea of where I come from. And as I say, why I enjoy this particular work, because to me, it just seems this treasure trove of stories. I mean, if I'm just being, sort of just being a hack, I'm just being a journalist, then it just seems to be an interesting path to plow down. I'm off to, I don't know if you go, I'm off to the Orlando conference.
I'm going. Yeah, I'm going.
We'll touch base. Yeah. I'm looking forward to going to that because I'm meeting all the people I write about. Get a different perspective. So, because most people I meet, well, I don't know about you, but I mean, I think anybody is that I had to be just a bit careful in a personal setting, because people can get quite upset, and I always say, so I just don't talk about climate change, unless I know that somebody is genuinely skeptical, because, people do get a bit upset. I mean, if I want information, I'll just go on Twitter, it's all, it's part of the job, if you want to be loved in journalism, go buy a dog, but, it'd be nice to sort of, be in a room full of people knowing that nobody's going to get, triggered by anything I say.
Okay. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in Orlando.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Okay.
Talk to you. Bye.